we were in before this whole maneuver, just on a different docking port. So if you're just joining us, we're actually coming up on the docking axis. So coming up on the approach to the space-facing port on the International Space Station. You're looking at a view of the Dragon spacecraft from ISS cameras. I know it kind of looks like a white blob, but that's just because of the exposure settings on the camera, which actually allows us to get some cool views of the thrusters firing as it gets towards the docking axis here. On board, we've got 3 NASA astronauts and 1 Roscosmos astronauts in their spacecraft, doing a port relocation maneuver that undocked from the space station on time earlier today. The next major milestone here should be a commanded hold at the 60-meter mark on the zenith axis, and then ground teams performing their go, no go for approach to waypoint 2. Great views of the spacecraft and those thruster firings. You can't normally see the thrusters if we were just looking at it without kind of this overexposed view.
Freedom SpaceX, we've arrived at the second 60-meter hold point and Dragon is configured for docking. Confirm readiness for approach 1, and we're about to have a teacher's handover.
So crew are going through their final checks coming up for the operation. They'll be viewing their procedures. That's actually what you see here. Commander Haig is scrolling through his procedure, making sure that he is familiar with the upcoming operations and steps, and then he'll give a call back to the core here shortly.
Freedom SpaceX on the big loop. Repeating the call, we'll look for crew readiness for approach 1.
Freedom copies, crew's ready for approach 1.
So with that call from Commander Haig, ground teams are going to be sending the command to continue with approach 1.
And SpaceX copies, Dragon.
We have just entered into an orbital daytime, so that's part of the reason why the space station looks significantly brighter at the moment. At the speeds that we're traveling around the Earth, the orbital daytime and nighttime happens significantly sooner than in a 24-hour day cycle here on the ground. And so in that view earlier, we had some great shots of the zenith port that the crew are going to be approaching. Now we're back on board the capsule, seeing a view on the displays. Crew look like they're comfortable, waiting for the approach maneuver. Now this shot on the lower portion, so what would be the bottom of the screen, is the forward port. That's the pressurized mating adapter. So Dragon was previously connected there. That's where the 31st cargo resupply mission is going to head to. And then the black circle in kind of the dead center of the screen is the zenith port. It's a little hard to tell from this view, but in the center of that, there is actually what is referred to as the docking target or a standoff. We saw some views of that on the forward port as Dragon was undocking and pushing away from station. That target has reflectors on it, and that's part of what Dragon uses to align itself as it's approaching station so that it comes in aligned both in the right orientation in pitch and yaw. for a successful soft capture. And so as we get closer on the approach, we're likely to get some camera feeds, at least assuming the coverage is with us as far as the data connections, but we are likely to get some camera feeds that show us that docking standoff target as we get back towards the hatches on the ISS side. And it looks like the orbital sunrise is also starting to backlight planet Earth behind us. So that's what we're looking at. And again, that's why we called the zenith port the space-facing port, because the other side is the Earth-facing port, or rather the Earth-facing view. So part of what's happening here is the ground teams are performing configurations, both on the International Space Station side for approach and
Freedom Space on the big loop. We're still waiting for our final goes to continue approach, but for your awareness, we are going to be planning a brief hold at waypoint 2 for Dragon Eye evaluations. So when we get to waypoint 2, we are going to hold for just a couple minutes.
Freedom copies, we're waiting on the goes to proceed and expect to hold at waypoint 2.
Now that call is a good example of what operational communication looks like. The view that we had there was of the SpaceX core. So he is that view right there. That's Arthur Burial. He is the counterpart to NASA's Capcom. And so provided communication on the big loop to the crew of here's what's happening. Here's when we expect to do our next maneuver. By the way, there's something happening at waypoint 2. We're going to do a hold there for the evaluation. And then the crew executing great communication as well, echoing back those calls to confirm that they have understood the information. That's pretty common in operational communication because words can get dropped as you're communicating between the spacecraft and the ground teams. And so echoing back those calls ensures that everyone is on the same page and no information was lost in the process.
Freedom SpaceX ground is go for continued approach and will be commanding resume to approach to waypoint 2.
Copies, we're go for continued approach.
And so with the call there, ground has configured approach for waypoint 2.
Houston, big loop approach is resuming to waypoint 2. Monitor for step 3 in 1.102. That's Dragon approach and retreat monitoring.
And with that, we are on our way.
Monitoring picking up in step 3, block Delta.
Great.
Anna, exciting stuff. We're back on our way to an approach operation towards the zenith port.
Yeah, thanks, Shiva, and thanks for walking us through the last 20 minutes or so during today's port relocation maneuver. Again, we just heard confirmation that we are go to resume approach to waypoint 2. And so once Dragon reaches that 20-meter point, it will hold one final time for teams on the ground and the astronauts aboard Dragon to do a final check before docking. Again, during this hold, teams will ensure final alignment, checkouts of the spacecraft, confirm readiness for final approach, and check lighting conditions. And while there aren't strict requirements to complete docking during a day or night pass, there is always the chance this hold could continue until the lighting conditions on the docking port are ideal. Just a moment ago, you saw a view from Dragon looking at the International Space Station as they are currently in one of those day passes. Again, we go through orbital day and night times about every 90 minutes as the space station orbits around the Earth. So Dragon will reach that waypoint 2 in just a few moments. We should hear that confirmation, and we'll hear that they're standing by for that hold. And then once ready, Dragon will begin its final approach. Final approach process takes about 4 minutes. And during that period, we will hear the call out for CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands-Off Point. This call occurs when the spacecraft is about 2 meters away from the docking port and means that any aborts need to be initiated by Dragon's flight computer after that rather than by the crew. Dragon is currently about 23 meters away from the International Space Station. Again, that waypoint 2 is at about 20 meters away, so just approaching that waypoint 2 just a couple meters away. And there on your screen, you see a live view of that space-facing port that Dragon is making its way to, and that will be its final parking spot or docking port today to make room for the 31st cargo resupply mission. And we're currently in a brief but expected handover period between satellites. And so that's the tracking and data relay satellite system that provides our video views from the International Space Station. But currently on your screen, you can see a live view inside the SpaceX Mission Control and NASA Mission Control here in Houston, and those joint teams are monitoring today's operations. So the NASA Mission Control team is responsible for all of the activities aboard the International Space Station, and the SpaceX Mission Control is monitoring Dragon and all of its systems. And Dragon has now reached that 20-meter mark for waypoint 2, so it's currently holding there as teams do their final checkouts, final alignment to make sure everything is good to resume for final approach for today's redocking to the zenith or space-facing port. And as Dragon holds at that 20-meter waypoint 2, the teams here in Mission Control Houston, as well as the SpaceX teams in Hawthorne, California, are currently conducting the go, no-go poll for final approach.
Station Houston Big Loop, please confirm that you have reviewed steps 5 and 6 and you are go for docking.
Station is go for docking.
And you heard some conversations between the Capcom or capsule communicator here in Mission Control Houston and NASA astronaut Don Pettit, currently aboard the International Space Station. Pettit has been monitoring today's operations from the station's cupola, and the Capcom serves as the voice link between teams here in Mission Control Houston and the space station crew aboard the International Space Station. And currently aboard the International Space Station, we have the Expedition 72 crew. So in addition to the Crew-9 crew currently aboard Dragon doing their port relocation maneuver, comprised of NASA astronaut Nick Hague, Butch Wilmore, and Sunny Williams, as well as Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov. We have Roscosmos cosmonauts Alexei Ovchinin and Yvonne Wagner, as well as NASA astronaut Don Pettit, who you just heard some words from a few minutes ago. And so those 7 crew members comprise the Expedition 72 crew currently aboard the International Space Station. And Expedition 72 began on September 23rd of this year and will end in the spring of next year once the crews depart on their respective vehicles. For those of you who are just joining us, we are going through Crew-9's port relocation maneuver from the forward-facing port to the space scene or zenith port on the Harmony module of the International Space Station. This will clear up that forward port for the SpaceX's 31st cargo resupply services mission. Today's maneuver began at 5:35 a.m. Central, 6:35 a.m. Eastern, when Dragon undocked from the forward-facing port and began today's maneuver. It backed away to about 60 meters and held there for a few moments before beginning its relocation above the station. And now we are currently holding at about 20 meters away from its new port, its new destination, which will be the space-facing port on the Harmony module. And we're just holding to ensure that everything is good on Dragon, everything is good on the International Space Station, and all teams are ready for the final approach to conclude today's port relocation.
On the big loop, Dragon Eye checkouts are complete. Things are looking pretty good. I'd like you to confirm crew is ready for final approach and visors are down. At this time, ground is go for approach 2.
Freedom copies all, visors are down, crews go for docking.
Copy, crew is go. Ground will be commanding approach shortly.
And there.
Houston Station on 2 for Dragon approach.
Good, Don.
Yes, for procedure 1.102, it ends at step 4. Where is step? Oh, I just found step 5 and 6. Disregard.
Houston copies. Station Houston Big Loop, Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. You can monitor per steps 5 and 6 in 1.102.
Station copies.
And we just heard a bit of communication between the teams on the ground as well as the astronauts aboard Dragon in the International Space Station. So all teams on the ground have pulled go to begin final approach, and the crew aboard Dragon and station also confirmed that they are ready to begin this approach. So Dragon has now left its hold at waypoint 2 and is beginning that final approach. So that process will take about 4 minutes to complete. About 3 minutes into that, we will hear a call out for CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands Off Point. So this occurs when the spacecraft is about 2 meters away from the docking port and means that any aborts will need to be initiated by Dragon's flight computer after that rather than by the crew. And then just a few moments after that, we will be standing by for initial contact and capture, which will then be followed by several different events to have a hard dock or hard mate of Dragon to its new port on the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. Again, it left the waypoint 2 hold, which is at about 20 meters away from the International Space Station, and is continuing to approach in. Right now, Dragon is about 13 meters away from the International Space Station and closing in on its target.
Get on 10 meters.
Copy 10.
And Dragon is now less than 10 meters away from the International Space Station, so in about 8 meters we will hear that call out for CHOP, which is the crew hands-off point, and then we will stand by for contact and capture. After initial contact with the space-facing port, its soft capture ring system on Dragon will retract to bring the spacecraft in closer for a hard capture, which will be accomplished by deploying 12 hooks. Again, 2 sets of 6 hooks to firmly hold Dragon in place. And that whole process will take about 15 minutes from the initial contact until we have the hard capture and docking complete.
Freedom, 5 meters.
SpaceX copies 5.
And just a minute ago on your screen, you could actually see the docking target, which is that crosshair target on the International Space Station. And Dragon is continuing to approach in closer. It's about 3 meters away, and 1 meter we will hear that call for CHOP or crew hands-off point.
Get on 2 meters, hands off.
Copy 2.
And we heard that call for CHOP and just standing by for initial contact and capture.
1 meter.
Freedom, SpaceX on the big loop, soft capture complete.
Copies, good soft capture.
And at 6:25 a.m. Central, 7:25 a.m. Eastern, we have confirmation of initial contact and capture. At that time, the International Space Station and Dragon were flying approximately 260 statute miles over the south part of Brazil. Now that we have that initial contact of Dragon with the International Space Station's space-facing port on the Harmony module, the soft capture system on Dragon will begin to retract to bring the spacecraft in closer for hard capture. So after that soft capture system begins to retract, we will stand by for the hooks to begin driving. Again, there are 12 total hooks.
Freedom SpaceX, ring retraction in progress.
Freedom copies.
So again, there will be 12 hooks that will drive close to firmly hold Dragon in place, 2 sets of 6 hooks, and then there will be 2 umbilicals that will deploy, and then we will have that hard capture complete. After that, there will be a series of leak checks, and they will begin pressurizing the vestibule, which again is that area between the station hatch and the Dragon hatch, which was previously exposed to the vacuum of space. So once that pressurization is complete, they'll do those leak checks, and then they will begin opening the hatches and bringing Crew-9 back inside the International Space Station, where they will remain until they return to Earth next spring. While we stand by for that hard capture process, let's go ahead and check back in one more time with Shiva and SpaceX.
Thanks a bunch, Anna. It's nice to see Crew-9 on the space-facing port. Of course, we're not fully locked into station yet until the hard capture hooks are securely in place and the vestibule is repressurized, as you were talking about. But as we're in the process of soft capture ring retract, that's getting us on the way to those next major milestones. So part of what the ground station teams are monitoring right now is there's a set of motors on the soft capture system. So those are retracting the system back in. We heard the call out right around the time that we were getting past the 60-meter hold and heading to approach 2. There was a call from the ground to the crew that the soft capture ring had extended. So that was getting it prepared for soft capture, and then now the ring retraction process. Once we get the rings fully retracted, then we start to head into the next major milestone, which Anna, you were just talking about, with the hard capture hooks being connected and the umbilicals that we disconnected earlier on the forward-facing port being reconnected. Those umbilicals are essentially communication and power lines. So they have a series of hard connections. You can imagine plugging in the Dragon spacecraft into the International Space Station. And that's a way that we share data between the spacecraft, the Dragon spacecraft, and the International Space Station, and how Dragon can also keep its power levels high by pulling some data from the International Space Station's power system.
Freedom SpaceX on the big loop, ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
Copies.
So the call there indicating that the International Space Station, which was in a slightly different mode for the approach operation and to damp out the loads from Dragon coming and docking onto it, is now transitioning into a more normal flight mode. Once that is complete, Dragon will proceed with its umbilical extension as well as the hard capture hooks. There are 12 of those hooks. They're driven in, they have separate motors on them, and they are driven in sets of 6. And those 12 hooks both secure the Dragon capsule to the International Space Station, but they also make sure that the seals that are on the top of the spacecraft and on the pressurized mating adapter are nice and secure. So once we start putting breathable air into that volume, that we keep that air in there. That'll be referred to as the vestibule pressurization. Once we pressurize the vestibule, ground teams will give a little bit of time to make sure that the vestibule is leak tight before we give the crew the go to doff their suits and then begin the preparation steps for ingress.
Station Houston Big Loop, MCS is configured, proceeding with hook driving.
So with that call up on the big loop, ground teams informing all of the crew that ISS is in the correct configuration to begin its for Dragon to begin the hard capture hook drive. Now the vestibule, we were talking about it a little bit earlier. That's the interstitial volume between the ISS's hatch, the space-facing hatch, and the Dragon forward hatch that had the docking target on it. And that small volume is what we pressurize. It's where the crew will eventually come through from the ISS side to the Dragon side and vice versa. And so when we pressurize that volume, we'll want to make sure that it is leak tight, that we're not losing gas from an imperfect seal. And then once we are confident that that is in a safe configuration, then the crew will be given their go to doff their suits or take off their suits. They wear those primarily as a precaution for certain contingencies. And they also have communication systems built into them, so it makes the operation a little bit easier to stay in communication with each other as well as the ground teams. So the crew will be given the go to take off their spacesuits, transition into some more comfortable clothing, what we're used to seeing them in when we get views into the International Space Station or other events on the space station, and then get back to the rest of their day, which I'm sure is full of additional science and maybe a little bit of rest after the operation. Now, depending on the timing here, the whole process of vestibule leak checks, as well as suit doffing and the other checks that are needed to happen, usually takes about 2 hours for a normal ingress. So depending on that exact timing, the crew will have the option to have some lunch. They actually, as part of their repacking of the capsule, brought in some lunch into the spacecraft. And so they may do that in the capsule if the timing allows. And we are expecting the hatches to come open around 9:05 a.m. Central Time. So far, a pretty clean, normal op. Very fun to see Dragon swap its ports, and also to kind of talk a little bit about the spacecraft. Anna, I think I'm going to send it over to you to take us through hard capture complete and the remaining steps to hatch open.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shiva. It's been great to walk through today's operations with you. Again, they are continuing to work through that hard capture process. So we had the initial contact and capture about 9 minutes ago at 6:25 a.m. Central, 7:25 a.m. Eastern. That first set of 6 hooks has been closed, and that second set of 6 for a total of 12 is currently driving closed. So once we have all 12 hooks closed, we'll have that hard capture that we've been waiting for, and we'll have docking complete. So we're just standing by for the final moments of today's port relocation. And again, once we have that hard captured, the crew will begin working through the hatch opening operations, which includes repressurizing the vestibule, which is that area between the Dragon and space station hatches that were previously exposed to the vacuum of space. And we just heard the call up to the crew from teams here on the ground confirming that we have hard capture complete. So all 12 of those hooks have closed, and it has formed that tight seal between Dragon and the International Space Station, which completes today's port relocation operations. So now that Crew-9, which includes NASA astronauts Nick Hague, Sunny Williams, and Butch Wilmore, as well as Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov, have redocked with the International Space Station, we will go ahead and conclude our live coverage of Dragon's port relocation maneuver. That redocking took place at 6:25 a.m. Central, 7:25 a.m. Eastern, as Dragon and the International Space Station were flying about 260 statute miles over southern Brazil. The crew will now take time to get out of their suits and begin the process of opening the hatches, which will take place in about 2 hours after they complete the repressurization and leak check process. Again, today's relocation maneuver began at 5:35 a.m. Central, 6:35 a.m. Eastern, when Dragon undocked from the Harmony module's forward-facing or Earth-facing port in preparation for NASA's SpaceX 31st Commercial Resupply Services mission to the International Space Station. That mission is scheduled to launch tomorrow, November 4th, and dock